Hello, everyone. I am Ekaterina, co-founder of Future London Academy, and welcome to another episode of our Creative Capes podcast. And today we have a special guest with us. We've got incredible Emma Wee that has been working in a variety of creative fields in creativity, education, research for the past 32 years. And for the past 9 years, Emma specifically has been focused on neurodiversity coaching, working with clients such as Universal Music Group, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Ernst & Young, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, among others, adapting working practices for the neurodivergent community, helping them reach their full potential. So Emma is incredible in many ways, and we'll talk about Emma's personal story in a second. But I feel like the topic of neurodiversity is incredibly important in the creative industry, and we as Futureline Academy want to give as many tools as possible for leaders in the creative industry to thrive and progress. So I am so excited to have this conversation today with Emma. Welcome, Emma. How are you?
It's actually been 12 years since I've been coaching. I'm a little bit older now.
We need to update that for sure. Well, I would love to start actually with you and your incredible story, because I feel like on one hand, neurodiversity and neurodivergent people are among us, and we all hear all these words like ADHD and Autism and Dyslexia, Dyspraxia. But on another hand, there are so many misconceptions and so many things that we don't know. And also so many resources that you can go to. So it's a bit confusing. So I would love to hear your journey of how did you discover that you're neurodivergent? What was this journey like?
I've been working as a theatre designer, performance designer for 20 odd years. And when I had my son 13 years ago, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to necessarily kind of design full time. So I was looking for something else. And one of the things that I'd always done as being a designer was work within education departments, particularly through the opera houses. And one company that I worked with for about 12 years, for now been over 20 years, it was a company called Total Key Arts. And they were one of the first organizations to do creative intervention work for young people who were autistic. At the time, autism was described as either high-functioning autism or Asperger's. And at the time, it was very much thought that there weren't that many girls who presented as being kind of, sort of what was seen as, it's now termed as low needs, but high-functioning enough to kind of be in the workplace. And so, strangely, I kind of was able to kind of have quite a kind of an easy dialogue with these individuals, and kind of always got on with them well, and always found a way of working with them really, really well, however verbal, non-verbal they were. And even at that time, I was kind of going, I think there's something going on here. And I'd always also had kind of quite a lot of emotional dysregulation, sort of sensory stuff going on, but I didn't know that was it. I just thought that I really struggled with anxiety and really struggled with kind of why was I so different? Why did I react so differently? And of course, did the classic thing, which is masking, which didn't make me terribly well. When I had my son, he experienced a stroke when he was born. So I was immediately thrust into the kind of whole world of trying to understand how brains worked. And I'd done quite a lot of inset training through the Royal Opera House and kind of various different opera theatres. I thought, well, I can do this. Like, there must be kind of corporate kind of away days that I can go and be in and work on communication skills, with a designer. And I spoke to a friend of mine. I said, look, if you had someone cold calling with a session for kind of professional development stuff, what would you want? What would it be? And she said, well, we have a lot of problems managing our software developers. Could you come and give us a talk around that? I said, well, there's probably quite a lot of them who might be kind of, as we said then, on the spectrum. We don't do that, no. And so I kind of went and gave this autism awareness kind of session, saying why kind of taking the Coke machine away was really disruptive and not having clear outlines and deadlines and stuff. And it just so happened that their new CTO went, you need to talk to a friend of mine who runs a company called Genius Within. And at the time, Genius Within was fairly new. It was about 2 years old. And they only really managed coaching for individuals who were dyslexic, dyspraxic, and they didn't have anyone who specialized in autism. And that was it. That was kind of how I kind of opened up the full nerdiness of my brain. And it was only when I started working with women who were formally diagnosed as autistic that I went, ding, okay, this makes sense. And everything that I was expressing in terms of kind of how I understood and how I got in terms of processing and kind of, I've always somehow been able to have a language where people kind of go, oh, God, yes, that's exactly how I want to express it. And I think that's why, coming from a creative space, being able to kind of have that sort of language to really kind of get to the guts of kind of what someone's experiencing, because that's what I did as a designer. It was a natural progression in terms of I'd always been interested in how brains worked and how, creatively kind of begin to create languages to communicate and stuff like that.
How was it discovering your own neurodivergent condition? Because I feel like when you discover it at the grown-up age, I think it can come as a shock because, as you said, you might feel some things are different for you than for other people. But actually, when someone puts a certain label on you, I think it can be a bit emotional. Did you feel anything?
I think what was really interesting is that kind of back then, sort of around 2012, there was still not really an understanding of kind of really how nuanced autism, particularly ADHD is, right? And so also the diagnostic criteria has always been very white male biased. So women, people of color have always been misdiagnosed and misdiagnosed, right? So that's why the criteria is shifting, but actually those people have always been out there. But they've masked massively. And I remember when I first kind of let the penny drop, as it were, it wasn't that I was still masking to a certain extent, I think, but I kind of used it in sessions because there was still, and there still is, a lot of preconceptions about autistic people ending up on the news as the people who kind of are kind of troublemakers, or they hack the Pentagon, or so I used to say, kind of rocking in corners or hacking the Pentagon or chopping up the neighbors, right? Because there's always this kind of really, oh, they're the weird ones, where they're different, therefore we need to think they're dangerous kind of narrative that's gone on from Rain Man onwards. And I remember kind of at the beginning, if I was doing an awareness training course, I would leave it kind of a good 20 minutes before I said, oh, and I'm also autistic. And people would just go, their jaws would drop, because people cannot compute that you do not look and sound like what they perceive as being a stereotypical autistic person. Because what is a stereotypical autistic person, right? So I think it's been a journey for me to kind of understand that knowledge for myself, but it has also been a massive relief to know that I manage myself in a very different way. And I accept and give myself compassion for if I'm feeling overwhelmed, and kind of I can name it. And particularly for if you're autistic, you need to know why, right? You need to understand why something's happening. And just understanding why I was different and how I behaved was different was a huge relief, actually. It meant that I didn't kind of go, oh, I'm just the broken one here.
It's so good to hear your story. And also, I feel like we'll dive into all sorts of misconception about neurodiversity in a second. But also, I feel like there are so many people who still are not even aware that neurodivergent is a thing. And as you said, mask it and guilt themselves into thinking that there is something wrong. Well, I think our brains are wonderful and all different. And I think that's what makes us creative. And actually, an interesting statistics for everyone, that about 20 to 50% of creative workforce is estimated to be neurodivergent compared to 15% of general population. So I feel like a lot of people on this call are from a creative or design industry. So there is a very high chance that either you or someone you're sitting next to is a neurodivergent individual. And I feel like the more we know about ourselves and how we can work with it, the better work we can create, and the more wonderful things we can do together.
I mean, I often say to people, particularly if they're creatives, you've got to where you are because of the way your brain's wired, not in spite of it. Okay. This narrative that you're broken, you somehow need to be fixed. That's the whole world of ableism, right? You need to fix yourself in order to fit with the pre-existing system. And there's also that thing of where, if you've grown up in this very kind of rigid kind of educational space where you have to sit still, you have to kind of pay attention, do more, then that's when you're kind of in a sort of building in this, what we call internalized ableism. Oh, it must be just me. I'm the one that's wrong. I need to work harder. I need to do better. And I think that that's incredibly damaging. And that's why when I'm working with someone, even if they've presented with one particular neurotype, I'm going, okay, let's just kind of tease out the strands of what's going on for you, because if you understand which part of your brain is kind of like spiking at a particular time, then you can kind of go, oh, it's that bit. Because often if people receive a diagnosis kind of very early on, but it doesn't express their entire experience, then they'll go, oh, well, again, it must be me, I'm the one that's broken, rather than saying, oh, there's maybe a little shade of that going on, a bit more of that kicking around at this different times. So I think it is important to kind of, I always say to my clients, look, I'm not slapping more bumper stickers on you. It's just about you being able to accept all parts of yourself and know that they're useful. And I think that particularly disability is always the thing that drives innovation. Difference demands different kind of light solutions. So therefore, we're the ones driving innovation in all areas and all spaces. And I think it is really important to kind of see those things as strengths, not as failings, not as things that need to be fixed. It's really important to kind of find some space for that. And it is a journey. It is a journey when people kind of get a late diagnosis. It can feel like there's a grief that can come with it. Why didn't I know this sooner? Why have I had to kind of like behave in a certain way? Why couldn't I have got to so and so? It's kind of, it's not the emotional aspect of kind of all of this is not to be underestimated.
I so agree with you. And I really love that you talk about it in such a positive way, because I'm personally 100% on the same page that it is a unique thing that we all have as a creative. That's why we can come up with ideas no one else came up with, because our brains are wired differently. If we all were neurotypical, then ideas probably would be very, very typical. So I think it is an incredible strength that we have such a diverse variety of brains, the ways of thinking, the way of behaving. And you're right, it's just understanding what tools that you need and understanding more about your brain so you can actually utilize it in the best possible way. That's all it is. While the world is potentially still built for neurotypical people. So that's why we struggle. It's nothing to do with us. It's more to do with the way that the structures and organizations are built, which leads me to kind of few more questions about the world of neurodiversity, because before we dive into all sorts of practical things that we will cover of how we can actually embrace things and what can we do as leaders with neurodiverse teams or as neurodivergent individuals ourselves, I would like to start with some definitions, because again, there is so many misconceptions, things that fly around, and you already started using some terminology like masking. As far as I understand, the definition of masking is essentially actually tell us, what is masking?
Masking is when people kind of, it's kind of like a social code switching. Right. So masking is the ability to kind of fit in, or the things that you do in order to fit in. And whether that's around language or behaviors, sort of in terms of kind of the model of kind of behaviors that you might kind of take on, or masking behavior might be people pleasing. It might be things like someone asks you to do something and internally you're going, oh, I really can't take that on. And you go, yes, of course. It's that kind of putting a face on and being kind of like all smiley and professional, when actually what you want to do is kind of go and hide in a cupboard and just kind of not do anything for half an hour, not talk to anyone else for kind of half an hour, or just lie face down on a rug, perhaps, rather than go into a meeting, but you kind of put your face on and crack on anyway. That's masking, right? I heard a brilliant description of it the other day, which was someone who is ADHD, and the social masking that goes on. It's imagining that you're in a room full of Australians, but you're not Australian yourself. And you have to pretend to be Australian every single second of the day, and you can't be found out. And I think that was such a brilliant description, because it just gives you an indication of just how much effort it takes to kind of like, engage in that. I think there's a guy called Professor Soul. He's on Instagram. He runs the Neurospicy community. But it was such a brilliant description. I was like, yes, of course, that's it. But it takes up huge resources, right? It takes up huge amounts of resources, social kind of resources and intellectual resources. And it was really interesting. I was doing an awareness training for a bunch of managers, and one of them came on and went, hi, I'm the crazy one. And like, as I was going through all the descriptions of the different conditions, I could see his face just kind of dropping. And I went, something's not right here. And during the break, he actually kind of emailed me, I'm so sorry. I just realized that I've been masking for 25 years straight. And now I'm completely broken by what you've just said to me. And he never came back on the call. And I was like, I had to email someone and say, please go and check on him. But he'd never heard it expressed in a way that he realized how much he'd been kind of doing to kind of basically fit in and kind of keep up and just not show that there was anything that, different that he was doing.
That's powerful. And I do believe, I think the more awareness spreads, the more people will discover this. And I feel like a lot of people go through that shock. And I think it's totally normal to realize that 40 years of your life, you didn't know something about yourself that is a very core part to you. But again, I see it in a very positive way, that it is the beginning of the new things that you can do. And actually, as you said, you got to where you are because of who you are. So therefore, it's a great thing. And now it can be only up from there.
I mean, you can think of us as like specialist thinkers rather than generalist thinkers, right? That's why certain brains are going to gravitate towards certain kind of areas of work. That's why you'll find a lot of certain types of brains. That's not to say that only those sorts of brains can do that work, right? But you will find them like calls to like. If those are particular strengths in your kind of your wheelhouse, then, and you've got those particular strategies to support the way you need to work in that space, then you'll kind of gravitate towards that type of work, which is why you'll find lots of people within those spaces.
I would love to dive into all the definition of different neurodivergent types that exist. And I can see that people are already sharing on this call who they are, what kind of neurodivergent type they are. So far, we do have a lot of ADHD people. So let's start maybe with that. Emma, can you tell us a little bit more? What is ADHD? And I suppose, how does it show up in the work environment?
So ADHD sits within what we call the clinical neurodiversity. So the stuff, how you're born, there's 4 different areas to neurodiversity: the applied, clinical, and then the acquired neurodiversities. And the applied and clinical are how your brain is formed, and particularly ADHD. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, hyperactivity is often not just kind of physical kind of busyness, but also mental busyness as well. And the main challenges you'll see are kind of things like distractibility, impulse control, and executive function, which is about kind of decision making. Very strong genetic links in terms of kind of like your parentage as well. And ADHD and autism, we used to see them as quite separate conditions, and they're now kind of more on a bell curve, right? So there's about 59 to 79% crossover traits. And that's often where a lot of people now are going to start getting diagnosed within that kind of crossover, because the more kind of classic presentations will sit either side of that kind of bell curve. So the things that you're likely to see with someone who is ADHD is they're probably great collaborators, really good at kind of coming up with lots of ideas, not always very good at finishing them. But they'll kind of be great at kind of like, sort of feeding off other people's kind of energies. One of the things that kind of classically happens is that it's not an ADHD brain can't pay attention. It's just there are lots of things competing for attention. So, for instance, someone will have a list of things that they need to kind of focus on, and all of them will have the same status. And what happens with the ADHD brain, when we go into fight, flight, or freeze, there's a bit of adrenaline that shoots into the prefrontal cortex, which kind of helps us make a decision. And it goes, you need to either thump the saber-toothed tiger or you need to leg it out of dodge. Which is it? And in the workplace, that would be, this is lastminute.com on, oh my God, there's a deadline approaching. And so the arc of attention, to place your attention on that thing, becomes much more kind of potent. It's much more present. And so an ADHD will typically be slightly more, I suppose, a prisoner of the present than be able to kind of sustain their attention over a long arc. When someone goes into hyperfocus, they're not actually sustaining their attention over a long arc. They've got lots of smaller arcs where they can see the end of the process very, very clearly. And when ADHDers don't finish something, it's usually because they've not defined what that final product is going to look like and feel like. Because there's kind of what I call this transitional anxiety. Oh, if I get to the end of it, then what? I don't know what's going to happen next. Oh, I'll stay here because all these bits and pieces, they're comfortable. I know what I'm doing with that, right? So that's kind of quite often kind of where people kind of go, oh, well, and they'll be obsessed by the newness. And then all the stuff that's like basically tying your shoelaces, like they can't be asked with, right? So they'll just leave that on the pile. That's where you kind of find some of the kind of like strengths and the challenges around kind of like ADHD. The other thing that kind of often comes as a real driver is something called rejection sensitivity dysphoria as well. And I kind of describe this as a bit like imposter syndrome on crack. Right. So it's kind of like this dual kind of driver that kind of goes, oh, yes, I'll take on all that work. Yes. I'll be a real people pleaser. And then you're time blind because you've got no capacity for all of this stuff. And then you end up going into hyperfocus and sit there at your desk for 6 hours and then wonder why you're a desiccated husk on the floor at the end of it. Or you'll just procrastinate because your brain's going, I don't know when this is going to get finished, but I know I've got to do it, but it'll probably be wrong and probably everyone will hate it, so I'll stay here. And then brain winds itself up because it goes, and now you need to do it. And now it's lastminute.com. And so then kind of like the fight, flight or freeze kicks in. So it's this lovely kind of like boom and bust kind of like cycle. But that's a classic thing around sort of ADHD.
Love it. There are so many great things that you mentioned about ADHD that, again, are not, I suppose, widely known. So one is that it's not lack of attention. It's actually a lack of choosing what to put attention to. And then when you actually get into this hyper-focus mode, I think a lot of creatives especially know and can identify themselves with like working the whole night on the project without like seeing anything and anyone, but without food, without sleep. You can really dive into something you are so attached to, attracted to, and you just can work and work and work. What was interesting that you mentioned, I did not know that it's actually not one hyper focus. It's few kind of arcs of hyper focus.
I think
that follow each other.
The way that makes sense to kind of describe it, because if you kind of have a process that like that drive to get something made, it's like, I know all these bits I know exactly the choices I need to make. Like everything else can just go by the way. When you haven't got a really clear idea of where you want to end up with something, then you've got all of the kind of like choices. And that's the thing that can lead to procrastination. Am I heading that way? Am I heading that way? And I'm heading that way. But once that clarity kind of sets in, then it's like, oh, this is easy. I can do this.
So that leads us to the next question. How do we deal with, if we know that this is how our brain wired, we like big ideas. We're good. Like we are the best in these meetings to come up with big strategies and thoughts and we are nailing it. But we know that finishing certain things is a challenge. What other techniques that can help us?
So there's two things. One is about the emotional tag that you attach to the finished product, right? So what's it going to be? What's the motivation, particularly with the stuff that you don't necessarily find the most interesting? Like, what is the benefit of you actually getting there? Because one of the ADHD things about ADHD brains in particular is that they rely on external validation, and being able to kind of pay attention to the good stuff that you do internally often gets skipped over because the ADHD brain's going, and next, right? So what often happens is that, you'll try something new and then after a few weeks, it's like, oh, well, nothing's changed, has it? I better go back to the old thing. The key thing to kind of be able to get yourself to a finishing point is to put yourself on the other end of that kind of finishing line. 3 months from now, once that thing's finished, turn around and kind of go, right, what do I want this thing to look and feel like when it's done, when it's at the best, when I know that it's the best thing that I can do, when I'm really happy with it? What does that look and feel like? How will I know that it's finished? Okay. And once you've defined that end point, then the brain goes, I know what choices I need to make. So you've got to get to the point where you can define that end kind of product and know what you're going to do to get there. And I suppose kind of being able to kind of notice the good stuff along the way is really, really key, because that's how you start to build in that kind of internal validation rather than relying on someone kind of go, yeah, that was really good. Or, like that kind of being able to kind of notice when you're actually doing something that's kind of working well.
I 100% agree with the strategies you identify, especially working with lots of different people. And I think as a creative, you have a lot of these tendencies overall. And again, we're not doing self-diagnosis here on this call about what condition everyone has, but you very often see within the creative people that kind of drive to do something, but then struggling to see what the final result is. And the classic one is people who want to finish, designers who try to finish their portfolio. It's like a never-ending project of like finalizing your website or portfolio, because there is always something that needs to be done, and or something that again kind of doesn't probably have a clear definition of what good looks like. And I love how you describe it, actually deciding how do we know we finished this project? How do we know that this is the final thing? And is it just we upload 10 projects, they need to have 2 paragraphs of description and it needs to have whatever, and that's what we're going for. And then I suppose giving yourself a leeway and saying like, well, I will update it afterwards if I want to, but this will be the option A that is going live, and that's what we're sticking to, and then we can always make it better.
I think one of the things that I quite often sort of get asked about is about procrastination, like how do I get out of procrastination? And often I think it's the brain has not necessarily seen where all the kind of the arcs are. Like it's trying to figure out, I suppose it's a bit like having a jigsaw puzzle right in front of you where all the pieces are just heaped up. If you don't have the front of the box to refer to, you don't know what picture you're making. And so your brain is just turning over those pieces constantly going, what's missing is a bit on the floor, I don't know. So once you've identified kind of what you're heading towards, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of figure out how those pieces fit together. And people kind of always assume that hyperfocus just comes out of the blue. It doesn't. There's a very specific set of variables that's unique to you, not just in terms of the work, but kind of physically, emotionally, intellectually, how you're set up to get into that zone.
I love that you're talking about very actionable things that, as you said, it's not you're waiting for hyperfocus or for muse to come and for us to finish anything that we wanted to do, but actually you can set conditions yourself. You're in control of how you want your brain to behave, and knowing how your brain behaves can help you set these conditions, set what the result is like, what are the steps, make it as clear as possible. There is no kind of confusion or choice at any point. And the clearer it is, I think brains in general don't like uncertainty, but especially I feel like ADHD brains definitely don't like any uncertainty. So I think the more certain everything is, the easier it is to follow the process and get to the finishing line. So
I mean, the irony is, of course, that an ADHD brain, hates a timetable. So if you kind of block things into a day and you get to it and your brain goes, no, not braining. And then you sat there staring at a screen for 20 minutes and then you're smashing yourself around the head going, well, I should be working right now. What you want to be doing is kind of choosing tasks according to where your brain is at. And that requires a tiny bit of structure, but not timetabling. So that's a different thing. So you've got to gamify your brain. You've got to work with where your brain is at in that moment. And I think it is important because I think the narrative, particularly around ADHD, and where kind of some people will kind of, they'll talk about ADHD tax. It's like, oh, there's something else that I've lost, or, oh, that's money I've spent and I've forgotten to turn up to it. It's that kind of, I know, I don't want to kind of say that people will weaponize this. And I know you want to ask about this later on, but everybody that I work with just they just do not want to be kind of a victim to the challenges. They want to find answers. They want to have strategies. And I think that's really important because everyone else is kind of laying blame at our doors for being the rubbish ones who can't organize ourselves and they can't communicate and they can't kind of keep to timetables. There's enough of that guilt being heaped on people. We don't need to do it for ourselves. We can be really good at stuff that other people find incredibly difficult. It's just sometimes the really simple stuff just kind of goes whoop, straight past us.
Yes to that. And yes, I think, and in general, I read the book called ADHD 2.0. I personally find it fascinating. I don't know if you've read or anyone else on this call read it, but one of the things that research identified, it was two researchers who both had ADHD who did the research, which is lovely. And they were talking about the fact that actually negative emotions, like whether it is like blaming someone or guilting someone, actually makes ADHD worse. And therefore anyone who was raised in the conditions, whether it's school or families, where you were punished for all those behaviors, actually made it worse long term. So you might have your ADHD might show up more if you constantly being kind of had this negative reaction to it.
And this is where the kind of like the argument of nature versus nurture comes in, right? So, sort of where we have the acquired neurodiversities, which are kind of like conditions that happen to you after you're born, right? So the things that sit within the mental health space, the transient ones. So that's kind of like, if you think of like your pre-existing neurotype as a hose pipe where everything flows, the acquired neurodiversity is like someone stepping on that hose pipe. And of course, when you have kind of, sort of any kind of anxiety or depression, it kind of becomes something that kind of really gets in the way of you processing well. And there is a kind of, I think there's probably about a 30% higher occurrence of particularly ADHD is experiencing trauma at some point during that kind of like teenage formative years, the kind of those social building years in particular. And so being neurodiverse doesn't automatically mean you're going to have poor mental health, but there's quite a high occurrence of it because people might not understand how they kind of work. Other people might judge them. Judgments like kind of, sort of lack of compassion around the way that they need to kind of process and all the rest of it. So, it's quite interesting when I'm working with someone who, who's clinically neurodiverse and then has a lot of trauma, or they're kind of bipolar, for instance, and kind of for OCD, all these things are quite separate, but you can see the point at where they kind of move into one another if that's kind of what's been going on for someone. So that's where I find it endlessly fascinating in terms of kind of like, oh, I can see where that's just moved into something different. But again, it's kind of when people don't have the answers and they're calibrating against what they're being told is kind of really, it can be really damaging if you don't have any other mirror to kind of hold up against. I have one client who She's late diagnosed dyslexic. Her parents knew that she was dyslexic because they had a test when she was younger, but then didn't tell her and spent her entire kind of like, the next 20 years telling her or kind of spouting the narratives that dyslexic people are really lazy and kind of useless. And she's now kind of been kind of diagnosed again as an adult, and she's traumatized doubly from it because these are people she's supposed to trust. It's really damaging.
We'll dive into dyslexia actually in a second, because I think this is one of the top conditions that we have actually today, neurodivergent types that we have. I actually don't like the word condition because I feel like conditions, disorders, they have such a negative feeling about it. While I think it's wonderful things that we have just different brains. That's all it is. And we should celebrate each one of them. So neurodivergent types, we'll dive into dyslexia in a second. I just remembered one more thing from the book that I personally find fascinating, which is hugs help. So for the ADHD, if you've been hugged as a child or even as an adult, that actually helps to, I suppose, calm down the brain. There are hormones and everything going on, but I suppose all these things that you just mentioned about extra processing and kind of what the ADHD brain might require, obviously hugging and creating a safe environment actually helps people. So hug. If you ever feel like you're overwhelmed, a hug might help you. Take it at your own risk, but that's something I personally found very fascinating. Now, let's move to the second. We have two more winners in this lovely poll. We have dyslexia and autism. Which one shall we go into next?
Dyslexia is one of the applied neurodiversities, and it is basically how you process words and sound. So it's not about if you can't read and write. It impacts everything in terms of kind of how you process kind of everything to kind of code, sort of encoding and coding, decoding, right? So I suppose one of the best ways of describing, kind of particularly within the creative space, is that you'll have this spiky profile for kind of being dyslexic. And one of the things that you'd be really good at is perceptual reasoning or spatial reasoning, right? So that will make you really, really good at spotting patterns and taking information and kind of going, oh, I can see where the gap is with that, and moving that information and kind of being able to understand that. Okay. One of the things that kind of the flip side of that is that your brain is also doing that with words and sounds. Oh, which way round is this sound? Does it fit with this shape? Right. And that's what takes the additional processing when it comes to reading, because it's decoding and encoding. So does that make sense? So your brain is probably really good at kind of like problem solving and pattern, like spatial manipulation. It's about 25% quicker for that stuff. But then it means that you're about 15% slower when it comes to kind of processing written word. And that's why it takes a little bit longer to kind of process it. There's a bit more to it. So like there's kind of how you process kind of phonological sound and kind of like where that kind of sits within the brain and stuff. But essentially it's kind of, it's not about not being able to read and write. It's just lots of other things around that. It's just those things typically will have a greater impact in terms of reading, writing, organization, time management. You know, the classic thing is you'd be great in a meeting, come up with lots of ideas, walk out, not remember a single action point. Right? Or come up with a fantastic solution and project and then go, oh God, how do I make a concise paragraph with that? Right? So that's where kind of things like assistive tech can be incredibly useful. To kind of gather your kind of thoughts. One of the classic things that I get to do with people who are doing lots of really involved client meetings is that as soon as they walk out, they give themselves a kind of essentially as though they're debriefing someone else that conversation, but send themselves an email, dictate an email to themselves so that they're emptying the brain out. It's like having a whiteboard that you wipe clean. So you don't have to hold all that sound in your brain until you get back and have to make sense of it. You can kind of rid of it out of your brain. And by the time that you get back to kind of wherever you're dealing with it, it's already kind of ready for you to edit.
This is so brilliant. And I love that we, I think, probably in the best time in life right now in the world where I suppose all these neurodivergent brains have so many tools that can help us, like, as you mentioned, dictation and then transcribing and all these things that are so accessible now to most of us. So I think, again, if you are aware that writing or reading is not how you naturally process information, then knowing that recording an audio note or whatever that is, that will be transcribed immediately as an email, as a note. And again, AI can now summarize it for you and all of that. It's wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, one of the classic things that I get people to do is kind of, there's a great tool called Goblin Tools, which is kind of an AI tool that's designed by ND Brains for ND Brains. It's very user friendly. But one of the classic things that a lot of dyslexics and sort of, sort of ADHDers as well is when they're trying to kind of cram this whole narrative that they have into their brain into a document that someone else needs to read. Quite often they'll read it, check it, wonder if it's the right thing, wonder if they're getting the right thing across. Autistic individuals are probably going to write bags and bags of content because they've got this a huge narrative, but it's too much for someone else to process. So actually you can stick it through a tool to kind of go summarize this or bring out the salient points, or what am I actually saying? How, judge the tone of this. What am I actually getting across, so that people can actually work a lot quicker, a lot more efficiently. And that's where the reasonable adjustments, all this tech and kind of, it's goblin tools. It's a kind of it's just an online tool. The two kind of things that I use predominantly with people is the judge and formalizer, which is a really great. So judge is what will judge the tone of, say, an email that you've received in case you might be reactive to it, and then it will also suggest a response. And formalizer can be, you can just go blah, dictate into it, and it will kind of put a filter on it, whether being, I love the kind of filter, more sarky, more polite, more professional, less kind of like waffle, more waffle. They're kind of like great kind of, typical filters that we kind of use, sort of as a colloquialism. But it means that it's like having someone there going, actually, this is how it's coming.
And do you think these tools, I think this is so great, all the tools that you mentioned, and I 100% agree that this is something we should utilize to most of its abilities, because I think this is so great that they exist and definitely can make life so much easier. I wonder, and I don't know if you have answer to that question, whether relying too much on tools overall. I think that's a conversation overall in the society. If we rely too much on Google and everything, we forget things, we can't remember anyone's phone numbers anymore, all of that kind of skill is lost. Do you think it's the same with neurodivergent brains, that we should give some sort of space for learning and strengthening the certain skills versus relying on everything? Where do you think is this balance between making our brains better and training them in the gym versus relying on tools?
I mean, I think it's the amount of effort. Like, I'll give you an example. I had a client who's Dyslexia and Dyspraxia. She's a journalist, and it used to take her about 3 weeks to kind of research, write, proofread, submit her articles. Once she had mind mapping software, dictation software, and read-aloud software in place, that went down to 2.5 days. So the amount of effort that it took her, that was kind of like, inherently, she was still doing the work, but she was getting there on par with her kind of, her peers. And that's where the kind of the leveling up of those tools that are. Whenever I use, when I'm writing in Word, I will use, there's a function design, which you can color the background of the page. So visually, I can make the text to background color a lot more low contrast. So black text on white paper is very high contrast. So if you're staring at that sort of format day in, day out, then your brain's going to get knackered really quickly. Whereas if you use it to kind of go low contrast, then you're not going to experience as much visual stress. I'm not doing any less work by writing my reports in that way, but I'm getting there with more bandwidth and kind of some resources left in the tank at the end of the day.
I love your example, because I think it also kind of shows that it's not just our brains, but it's the world that we live in that requires things that are not natural to the brain. Just writing a report is not what ancestors did. So therefore, our brain was never wired to write a report. So using an artificial tool to write a report is totally normal. Because I think that's essentially, we found an artificial task and we use an artificial tool to do this artificial task. And like reading things on the screen, again, our nature is much more beautiful than black and white. So therefore, our eyes are not used to looking at something that is so high contrast. So it only makes sense that we get tired.
I mean, it's not a coincidence that dyslexia was kind of discovered, shall we say, around about the time of kind of the Industrial Revolution, because that's when book printing started to come into the fore and formal education started coming into kind of like into society. Before that, those people who were dyslexics, ADHD, who didn't do the book learning were the entrepreneurs, were the ones who were the makers, who were ones that kind of like came up with new ideas. So it was only when kind of formal education became kind of the norm, these challenges started to be discovered. hello ableism, right? That's kind of where, sort of people were being kind of judged for not keeping up with the norm. Whereas in fact, they'd been doing pretty well until then.
And maybe that's the time where we change the world and make it a bit more creative and less set up for only one type of brain. And I feel like there is a lot of already change happening, but I think it's really empowering to know that it's nothing wrong with us. It's just the world has been set up in a weird way that is absolutely not natural. And we just need to find different ways to make it more natural to our brains. Which leads us to the next talk, one of the top 3 types of neurodivergent brains that we have today in this conversation, which is autism. So tell us more about autism.
So I describe being autistic as having my senses on max the whole time. So I'm absorbing vast amounts of energy and kind of sensory information constantly. So it's a bit like a seesaw. I've got all this kind of high level kind of capacity for seeing all the what ifs, right? My brain can see all the kind of variables and how that's going to pan out very quickly. And this seesaw is kind of like high level processing, sensory social processing on the other end of the seesaw, and it can flip out at any point, right? So it can mean, so for instance, when someone was banging on the door just then, I literally could not hear what you were saying. It wasn't that it was particularly loud. It's like socially, I could not engage with what the language you were saying at all. It just kind of cancelled out. So the seesaw just went because that was such a sensory distractor for me. And there's lots of different kind of aspects around autism, but I think sort of predominantly there is, one of the things that sort of the classic thing is that people have this misconception that autistic people don't have empathy, whereas in fact we're just experiencing things at a very high level. So all of that social language, all that kind of like sort of how we're supposed to understand what you're feeling and what you're saying gets really confused very quickly. And one of the things around that is the social mirror neurons in the autistic brain are switched off. So these are the kind of the monkey see, monkey do cells, right? I see someone pick up a spoon to eat, I pick up a spoon to eat. And the social mirror neurons are not switched on in the same way. So that's where they're not picking up kind of the nuances of kind of like someone's body language or tone in the same way. There's only 60% of what we experience kind of communicate is words. Everything else is like my face doing something weird or like tone, right? So all of that gets very confused. What will happen with, particularly someone who is autistic is that the small talk will feel quite stressful because there are lots of variables where all those conversations can go. Whereas if you're just talking to someone in a shop and you're just buying something, there's only so far that conversation will go and you'll be kind of probably all right. Okay. So it's about kind of like, well, how much capacity have I got to deal with all the what ifs versus, something that's kind of clear and predictable and kind of like quite concise. That's fine. I can deal with that. I think one of the kind of the key things is that sort of this idea of kind of being sort of unable to deal with change. Not really. I think it's really what I experience sort of particularly with creatives is that if you understand the landscape, right? If you're in control of all those variables that sit within your world and you understand what they are, for instance, for me in theatre is completely chaotic. Nothing ever goes the way that you want it to, right? It'll always happen. That's my mantra. It'll always happen. But I've been doing it long enough to know where all those variables can go. So I can deal with the change in that space. But if you tell me the wrong entrance to go into a building, I will lose it very quickly. Right? So it's kind of the seesaw kind of flips kind of quite quickly. It's one of those things where someone might be seemingly incredibly very productive and kind of high processing and able to do very, very complex stuff. And then they can't figure out how to open a file. It's kind of like,
I love how you
annoying.
differentiate kind of different misconceptions and things around like how the brain works, because I agree. I think autism probably is the one that has the most misconceptions overall. And I think it also, speaking of negative biases and connotations, I think historically it had so many negativity around it. And I think that actually is probably, again, we can look at many successful leaders, inventors, and people who've done lots of things, and they do display certain traits of autistic brains. So therefore, again, we're not going to diagnose anyone by how they look, but there is a high chance that a lot of inventors and people who solve these difficult problems kind of had a very differently wired brain. I would love to hear a little bit more also about what, if you know someone, it's like one thing is understanding yourself, but a second kind of part is obviously as a leader who has to lead a team that has all sorts of different neurodivergent people. And we just talked about the 3 ADHD, dyslexia and autism. What would you recommend kind of things to do to make sure that you actually create this inclusive environment for everyone?
I think what's really interesting is that particularly if you're kind of being someone who's gone through a career and kind of found their way of working and then they create a company, so you're leading other people. Where the conflict often comes is where the assumption is that everybody thinks the same as you, right? Why don't you get it? It's really obvious to me. Why aren't you doing it the way that I would do it, right? So I think kind of being able to kind of have spaces where you say, okay, so what works well for you in terms of communication? It might be, I need to have regular check-ins. Okay, but what does regular check-in looks like? Is that every week? Is that twice a month? Is that 3 times a year? What does regular check-in look like for you? And being able to ask questions without assuming that you know what that answer is, I think is really important, because that's where, trust is built, isn't it? Being heard and kind of that stuff being paid attention to. And I was just talking to a client the other day, and she was complaining because this other person didn't know how to do their job. So what do you mean they don't know how to do their job? She said, well, I've explained it 3 times and they keep coming and asking me again. So is there perhaps something in the way that you're explaining it that they're not processing that information in the way they understand it? So the assumption that someone doesn't know how to do their job, like I would say, where's the curiosity? Don't assume that everybody works in the same way that you do and blame them for kind of not having the same kind of speed or kind of lack of it, whatever, in the way that they're kind of understanding. Look for different ways of kind of sharing information.
I personally found that the more interesting, extreme versions of the brain you find in your working circle, the more you actually improve your processes as a company. There is a mantra overall about inclusive design that designing for edge cases improves process for everyone. And edge cases can be whether it is certain abilities, kind of extra abilities or disabilities. The classic example of if you're designing a knife, you can design a knife for a professional chef who uses more than any other person in the kitchen, or for someone who has kind of any conditions that stops them from using normal knives. So it's, again, no matter which edge case you look at, if you design for edge cases, actually you create a product that will be so better, faster, easier to use for everyone. And the same, I think, applies for any sort of team culture, briefing. How do you report, anything like that? If you listen to these edge examples of someone not understanding you, someone repeatedly doing something different, and really try to understand what would make this process better. Is it everything needs to be written in a certain way, in a certain format? Actually, that will be better for every brain.
Yeah,
so
I often say to companies, don't get so wound up on the kind of like, we have to have an individualized work plan for every single person. How do you step back and make the space work for everyone? It's about kind of being able to, and this is where the masking kind of thing is really interesting, whether you're neurotypical or neurodiverse, it's the pressure points at which you kind of go, well, I'm just going to do it because everybody else is doing it. That's probably a pressure point where you could do with a different system, right? Oh, we just get on. This is just the way we do things around here. Is that really the best way of doing things around here? Or is it just because everybody's been doing it from day dot? I think it's kind of, that's when I'm working with organizations, I get them to look at what resources and kind of what hurdles exist within communication, onboarding, interviewing, the unspoken ground rules from a neurodiverse perspective, because they're going to be the initial kind of pressure points, the masking points where people are going to go, it's going to cost me more to work in the way that everyone else is working because I'm already kind of dealing with a load of extra processing.
And following, actually, I think you mentioned that last time we spoke, and we had our internal workshop as a team where we created the manual of me, and where everyone can download that one. But we found it incredibly helpful to actually sit down as a team and discuss these things. Again, how do you prefer to be briefed? What makes a good working condition for you? And then kind of lots of nuances. What makes you stressed? What makes you excited? And it's fascinating to see how, again, lots of things that you assume everyone is the same. Who would not like it that way? Or everyone hates that. Of course, it's how things are. And when you hear everyone's answers, and also when they talk more about why they prefer it that way, you're like, oh, wow, there are like so many things that you just assumed are the norm even if you are a neurodivergent person yourself, again, there are other brains that wire differently. So I think it's so good to just actually communicate and understand how everyone works and just create a system and a place where everyone can contribute in the same way.
And I think one of the phrases that I often kind of encourage individuals to use is, rather than saying, I can't do X, Y, and Z because of blah, 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 what works well for me is this means that I can. Okay. What works well for me is this means that I can. If you kind of say, I can't do X, Y, and Z, then you've got this hurdle. People see the label, they can't see beyond that. If you spent some time figuring out your solutions and then manage expectations about this is what you'll see if these solutions are in place, A, kind of disclosing without having to disclose. B, you're showing that you understand yourself and you're not just waiting for an answer, right? I can't get things on time because I'm ADHD or whatever. Actually, what works well for me is having clear deadlines and a reminder 2 days before it's due. This means that I can deliver things on time, right? It's a very different narrative, that, isn't it? It means that you're owning the process, and coaching in particular is based off those two principles: self-awareness and the responsibility to do something with that. It's a very practical thing. It's not like you just kind of sit there and someone tells you a bunch of stuff. You have to own it and you have to understand it. And so kind of being able to spend some time really understanding how your brain works and what it needs to work at its best means that you're going to be bulletproof. You're not having to wait for someone else to give you a solution. You can kind of go, actually, I know what the solution is. And you can't tell me I'm lesser because of it, because you're getting all this good stuff at the other end.
I'm so glad you mentioned this because I wanted to spend some time talking about the dark side of knowing everything about all these conditions and people self-diagnosing or diagnosing others and kind of putting this label left and right. I cannot do this. I'm dyslexic. I don't want to do this. I'm ADHD. But I love how you spoke about this from the point of enablement and responsibility. So first of all, you need to be aware of what you have, but then also you need to be responsible for how you want to behave with other people to get the work done.
I mean, I think there's a certain amount of, when people kind of arrive at a certain point and they don't have the tools and they don't have the strategies because they've never been allowed to learn them or discover them, then there's all the ableist narrative, like you can't do this because you're X, Y, and Z. Then that becomes a bit of a perfect storm, right? Because actually what you're doing is if someone doesn't feel as though they can achieve something, they're kind of backed into a corner. And so they'll kind of go on the defensive. I can't do it because of X, Y, and Z. Because often when managers go, well, what do you need? How can we help you? I always describe it as a bit like, the scene in Jungle Book when you got the vultures on a branch and they're going, what do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? And nobody has any answers because they're just going back and forth, right? So being able to kind of really understand what you need is really, really key to you then going, oh, there's a solution here. Brilliant. I don't have to wait for you to tell me how to do something. So I think that that's kind of one of the things. It's about being able to kind of investing in someone. And I think it's about if someone is not performing on a certain level, being able to kind of understand that there may be things that are kind of dips in the challenges. I don't like calling them weaknesses. It's about what are the things that need tools? What are the things that need strategies to level up? So then you can start to see all the good stuff. Because essentially when you've got a brain that can do all that creative kind of problem solving, can think out the box, can kind of work in different ways, you want to really harness that for a business. But all the grunt work, the way that the business kind of operates, that needs the stuff that kind of like feels really difficult. So that's where you need the extra tools. I think it's really interesting in terms of kind of, the judgment that someone will have placed on them if they're not functioning or performing at a level that is seen as acceptable. And it's often conflated with them as a person, rather than going, what's not working well? There's some organization and time management stuff. Does that mean they're a bad person? No, but they're said to be lazy and therefore not worthwhile. And if they've heard that narrative throughout their lives, then there's a certain point where they're going to go, yeah, I am not very good. So if you can separate that out as a leader and go, okay, so what's working well? All of this stuff. What is the stuff that's not working right? Right. What can we do? What are you seeing and hearing that's telling you that stuff's not working well? Once you level up that process, once you put tools in place, that's when you can start to say, is this person able to perform? And if not, then it's about saying, is this job the right thing for you? But until you've got all those tools and strategies in place, you can't really make a count on that. Being diagnosed officially and being undiagnosed does not make one jot of difference to that person's life in terms of having a report, right? What makes a difference is understanding how to support the brain and having tools to do that. But having an official label, it might give people answers. It might kind of go, oh, that makes sense. But fundamentally, in terms of how they run day to day, does not make one jot of difference. And that's where kind of, if you associate with traits and kind of see yourself validated in certain levels, numbers of traits, then that's all well and good, right? But unless you've got the tools to be able to support the way that you need to work in a particular space, then it's still going to be chaos. It's going to completely continue to be chaos from job to job. That pattern's not going to change.
And how would you go about, I love how you spoke about this of kind of creating reasonable adjustments, understanding the tools, but also still be clear, it's not an excuse not to do work. Like, you need to give people fair chance. You need to understand how they perform, what conditions you need to create for them to perform at their best. But then it's also okay if this is not the right role or the right job. It's also okay if you create all the conditions and all the adjustment and the performance still not there. It's still fine. I think, like, on a human level, we're all different and we each have a perfect place and perfect role that we can do and we will enjoy. And just sometimes it's not the right match, and it's totally fine.
And it doesn't have to define you, right? It doesn't have to define you. It's not a failure. It's just a kind of a learning experience. And I was working with a young woman recently who she'd gone into a very corporate space. She's autistic. She'd kind of been there for kind of about a year. One of the things we did towards the end of kind of her coaching was kind of look at her working values. Like, what are the things that were important to her in the workplace? And actually, none of it was about the performative stuff. It was all about being supportive and kind of having an inclusive space that accepted her and saw her strengths. That could be any space, right? But because none of that was being fulfilled, that was kind of and it was, the work was not interesting for her anyway. So it was kind of, okay, so let's move on to something else then, right? Let's just kind of get another job because it's fine. That's not working. You don't have to feel as though it's all your fault. That's just a bad fit.
So how would you go about it? Let's say you're a leader, you realize that you have this team and you might not know all the answers as well. I feel like that's another thing. Like, no matter how many books you read and how much research you do, I think there's still so many things that you will never know about every single person and condition. So, and as you said, like, if you just go to your team and say, what do you need? And they'll be like, well, we don't know what we need. So how would you go about it? Let's say you identify you want to make this investment in creating an inclusive environment. What would be maybe the first few steps that you would do as a leader to create this supportive environment where everyone can perform?
I think one of the things that kind of, obviously having clear kind of non-judgmental conversations that are kind of like, and even the way that you give brief, like making sure that people are not just walking out going, yeah, I understand that, like checking that they kind of get what you're talking about. Because if you're not communicating clearly, then you're not going to get the product that you want at the other end of the process, are you? I think kind of being able to quite often people will have developed lots of strategies to do the way that or match the way that they need to work, but they will often forget those things. Like 90% of the time when I'm saying, have you tried this? And go, oh yeah, well, I used to do that. It's like, why aren't you doing it now? It worked then. Why are you not doing it? Oh, because no one else does it. I don't feel as though I've got permission to do, right? So, a lot of the time you can kind of go, right, can you think of a time when you were organizing yourself well? Or is there something outside of work where you're able to organize yourself well? Right? What are the elements that allow you to do it there? Then you've got a model you can transfer across into the space, the workspace, because there's going to be variables that your brain has naturally been able to kind of utilize. That's the working model. And I think sort of being if someone is asking for reasonable adjustments, is going, well, what are the things that you need to kind of, what's the work that you're doing? What is it that you need to make? Where are the pressure points? What are the things that feel easy? What are the things that feel challenging? What can we do to kind of like support that stuff? And not shying away from kind of conversations where someone might need to do something differently. I also think modeling good practice is really essential. If you're the person that sits at your desk for 8 hours a day and doesn't take a break, then you're going to get a load of burnt out brains right behind you. So kind of being able to model good behavior, kind of healthy working behavior is really important as well.
Thank you. I think this is really great advice. And I like how you talk about this in a very much coaching way of having a conversation. It's not about having one meeting, please write all the things that you need and we'll do that. It's more of a, okay, go back, have a think, Where are these things that you need help on? Where did it work outside of work? What kind of things have you figured out in life? And having this more reflective conversation with someone so they can also find answers that maybe they don't know yet, and they kind of can reflect on this. On the flip side, if you are a neurodivergent or you suspect you're neurodivergent or you've been actually diagnosed, we had lots of questions about stigma at work. No one will understand me. And again, we are very privileged to be in a creative world where maybe there is a bit more accepted, but especially if you are maybe in not such a creative company where maybe neurodivergency is still seen as something bad. How do you go about it? Do you disclose? Do you not disclose? Do you talk to anyone? Like, let's say you found out that you are neurodivergent. What to do next?
It's actually was saying that what's quite interesting is that kind of a lot of the what you would see as kind of more neurotypical industries have actually kind of really had to pull their bootstraps up a lot around neurodiversity and had to put reasonable adjustments in place. When I think about kind of the performing arts in particular, yes, there are bucket loads of NDs, but actually because there's so many freelancers, disclosure and asking for kind of like for reasonable adjustments is often seen as oh God, they're a pain in the ass. We're not going to employ them again. So a lot of people won't disclose and they won't kind of ask for things that are seen as kind of like, oh, that's a bit too much, right? So I think it's a tricky one because I think a lot of the creative industries is that assumption, oh, well, everybody kind of can work in this space because everybody's brain works like mine sort of thing. Why do you need extra stuff? And so it's kind of, I suppose the thing is sort of if you've got a space where you're kind of creating a space where everybody can engage with the work and is comfortable and is kind of feeling as though they've got space to discover ways of working, do you have to disclose? That's the thing. And I think so disclosure is really tricky. There are still some places that kind of, particularly around autism, like people would be really severely judged through doing nothing different at all. And I think part of that is to do with, the kind of herd mentality. When people kind of disclose, if they've been around a certain number of people, it's a bit like a constellation, star constellation, right? You've got these different points on the constellation and everybody kind of calibrates by, locating themselves to kind of one another. And if one of them appears to change, everybody freaks out and goes, oh my God, I'm different now. I must be different. It's like, no, you're still the same. It's just, different information, right? But that's where kind of people really kind of like struggle with disclosures because it's by its nature can make people feel quite vulnerable because people will treat them differently. So I think that's where you kind of get into the space. Well, if you're an inclusive workspace and you're supportive of people, then, being able to normalize these conversations will make them feel more able to kind of say, actually, I need to work in a slightly different way.
So am I right to say that if you don't feel safe to disclose, do not disclose? If you feel like it's an inclusive environment?
No, I don't think so. But it is quite often where, a neurodiverse person is often expected to be the educator and to be the one to tell everybody kind of what they need, or they kind of like, explain what being autistic or explain what being ADHD is, or, with the conditions that say in the chronic fatigue space, or kind of like, there's a condition called FND, which is functional neurological disorder, where the nerves just don't play ball half the time. It's like the software's kind of, the computer's fine, but the software's kind of corrupted. And, people might appear drunk one day and not be able to speak one day, and then are perfectly fine the next. And massive assumptions are made about that individual because they're not consistent from day to day, right? So how do they feel safe enough to kind of say, well, there's something going on for me, when all they want to do is kind of work? We're still not there. I think we're kind of like, we've come a very, very long way from kind of seeing reasonable adjustments and kind of being able to, and kind of say coaching and strategy coaching as being something that's an automatic kind of way out. And I think one of the key things is making kind of workplace needs assessments and conversations in work feel like they're not an automatic step to the exit. I think that's really, really important. And like last week was Menopause Awareness Week, and I was doing a lot of talks around menopause, because menopause, perimenopause is seen as an acquired neurodiversity now because it has such a massive impact on kind of people in the workplace. And, I think it's really important to kind of not to let people feel as though they can find support without feeling as though they're going to lose their jobs, essentially, by kind of asking for support.
I agree with you. And I also would say, I think it's such a personal choice, like in general, to disclose or not disclose. And I feel like no one should be forced to disclose that.
Make someone disclose, full stop. Yeah. You shouldn't be disclosing like 4 people either, I mean, if you think about any other kind of types of kind of like diversity, you know, so when you think of like someone's sexuality, like you wouldn't stand like as being a kind of a team meeting, go, oh, by the way, they're gay. You know, it's like, you know, it's like, you wouldn't do it. It's rude. So why do it with any other kind of like sort of, you know, kind of identify?
100%. And I feel like probably maybe the first step, if you feel like your workspace is not ready or not there with understanding neurodiversity, maybe invite someone like Emma to have a neurodiversity awareness, some sort of, or just kind of talk to someone in HR or people officer to say that maybe we have people in the team who are neurodivergent. Wouldn't it be nice to have a bit of an awareness day? We can invite someone to talk about it so we can all learn what does it mean. So you don't need to specifically say, I am the one. I think it's probably you're not the one, first of all. There are other people who are masking it very well. And I think bringing just awareness as the first step to the entire organization could be a great way for people to open their eyes and see it's like, oh, actually, we can relate to lots of things that are happening. And again, you might find kind of that's a good conversation started to reasonable adjustments, tools and processes that can go from there. I'm conscious of time. Seriously, I feel like we need like a 10 episode series on this topic because there are so many other conditions, topics, things that we can dive in. But I thought we'll do a fun round of kind of advisory. So we have few different scenarios of like what leaders need advice on, and we would like you to help as a coach with kind of few maybe notes of what would you do. So I'm going to share one by one different scenarios and maybe kind of your first thoughts of what you would do in this situation. A team member avoids group brainstorms and prefer written output. What would you do? How would you go about it? You invite someone for a brainstorm, they don't come. They're like, I will.
So is there a way of them being able to contribute remotely? Is there a way of being able to kind of have an online version of the same kind of brainstorming kind of tool, giving them kind of some of the information ahead of time so they can submit some of the stuff that they kind of like want to kind of suggest, and then having an opportunity for them to kind of inputs into it afterwards as well. You know, kind of being able to sort of manage the kind of resources that you have as well. So if you have to go to that space, then making sure that you might have some decompression or not go to meetings beforehand and no meetings afterwards, that sort of thing can kind of, you know, useful in terms of kind of, it's about kind of managing the resources you have if that's a requirement. It's a bit like building a business case for kind of people working from home, right? So I've got someone at the moment who's been working super productively for years working from home, but now there's like this insistence that they kind of return to office. It's like, so they're not going to get anything done in the office, but they're doing really well at home. I'm not sure and it causes them distress to come into the office. Not even sure that makes good business sense.
Thanks. Great advice. A designer with ADHD consistently misses deadlines, but delivers great ideas. What do you do?
Okay, so then it's about kind of going, well, what is not working well? What is it stopping them kind of getting to that deadline? And it might be that they don't understand the impact of kind of not finishing that deadline. There may be a little bit of that kind of naughty kind of like, you know, sort of fight, flight or freeze kind of like thing going on. Well, I know I'm going to get some calibration back if, you know, sort of something's going to happen, a reaction's going to happen if I don't deliver it on time. And that will kind of actually spark my brain off. I think one of the things about particularly ADHD is they actually need quite a lot of calibration, I call it. People think it's about being needy or needing too much feedback. Actually, I think it a bit more like a racehorse, right? So you've got a racehorse. When they going over hurdles, if they lose their rider, it'll go to the front of the queue and it'll keep going dun 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 dun, and then after a while it go, oh, I'm just going to tail off, right? So in order to kind of keep that racehorse doing well, you need to kind of keep it going with some motivation, knowing it's on the right track. Someone who's not delivering on time, you need to keep kind of almost towards the end, kind of going, yeah, you're on the right track. It's fine. We're going to get there. And this is what it's going to feel like at the other end of it.
Love it. That's great advice. During discussions, someone keeps interrupting others impulsively.
So it's tricky. One of the things that can... So I'm thinking about a client I had who used to do this so badly that people would be terrified to say anything because he would just jump in. And when he was describing it, I said, you do realize that you in a meeting is like people being in a room and then you shaking up a Coke bottle, opening the door and just lobbing it in there and it exploding everywhere and everyone's going, no idea what's happening. And so the thing that I did with him, which was really useful and sort of actually worked really well, because he used to do it in another company, was have a mini meeting before the main meeting. So he could go, blah, what's everyone doing? Blah. Just do all of that and basically kind of get rid of all that extra energy and then have questions that he had to listen out for. And he shut up for about 70% of the meetings thereafter. And all he had to do was just let go of some of that steam. So he wasn't the kind of like Coke bottle kind of shooting everywhere.
That's brilliant. I love it. I heard also someone once advising to write, like whenever you have a thought or a question, make sure you write it down. And instead of like saying it, just trick your brain to writing the thought rather than saying it.
Yeah.
And
that can be problematic for some people because quite often they'll worry that they'll miss the next bit. Like that kind of FOMO is quite kind of big. So kind of like being able to, I think what can be helpful is kind of having plenty of points at which you summarize what's being said up to that point.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Love it.
So that you don't just go like hours and hours without having a break. You kind of like stop every 20 minutes and go, so just to summarize, this is what we've discussed up to this point. Is there anything else that we've missed?
Next one. A neurodivergent colleague reacts emotionally to feedback.
Okay. So if you have someone who is reacting rather than responding to feedback, then there's a good chance that what they're responding to is fear that something terrible is going to happen to them, right? And it may not just be the way that you're saying it, it's the kind of like the what's coming out of your mouth. So if you're trying to be nice about some feedback or you've just gone straight in with the bad stuff, invariably that person is just going to feel like I've got to be on the defensive. I've got to justify kind of my existence here. Trying to make the language transactional can be really useful. So the tool that I like using is something called clean feedback. It's part of the clean language model. So something that's working well and why, something that's not working well, what's the impact, something I'd like to have happen differently and what this will mean. And what it means is that if you use that script, anytime you're giving feedback, both sides know that it's very fact driven and it's transactional rather than being emotional. If you're trying to say something that is kind of a nice way of delivering it, particularly if someone's autistic, what happens, and I quite often relate it to kind of, Charlie Brown in the classroom when the teacher's talking, it's like, wah, 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 right? That's what's coming. It's just noise. And actually the autistic brain is going, for the love of God, just please get to the point. And by the time they're kind of listening, waiting for the point, they're already wound up because they feel that like they might have missed some of that language. So the more specific and clear and direct you can be with the facts, making it transactional rather than it being emotional, will mean that you'll probably have better outcomes.
Fantastic advice. I have one last one. 2 neurodivergent team members have clashing communication styles.
That's it? Okay.
What do you do?
Yeah, what do you put them on opposite sides of the room and play tug of war with balloons? Yeah, I think sort of, again, it's about having language that can be clear and kind of also what time of the day are these people meeting, right? If they've already just come from back-to-back meetings, there's a really good chance they won't have any spoons left to mask, think clearly, have agendas, right? Kind of decide what it is that you want to kind of like get from the meeting to start with. Where that kind of clashing kind of often comes is where someone is arguing over semantics of something. And I call it a little bit like, stop staring at the rock, look at the landscape. What's the landscape? What do you actually want to achieve from this conversation rather than getting all pissy sticks over kind of like the details, right? So kind of set out the conversation, and any time it starts veering away from kind of like that outcome is like, well, I noticed we're not kind of on track. Let's get back on track. What do we need to achieve from this conversation? But clean feedback, again, is a really good way of kind of, having transactional conversations. And as a tool, it's been invaluable for kind of getting people back in the room, talking to one another, because if they have conversations that they know they can get in and out of without it getting into conflict or getting difficult, then over time they can build trust to go, I can actually have conversations with this person and it's not all going to go to hell in a handcart, basically.
Can I add one more? How do you deal with if it's...
That's it.
No, sorry.
That's it. Done. No.
Sorry, no, there was a follow-up question. What if it's in an open plan office? Like, what do you do if there are two different personalities in an open plan office?
Then I think kind of, respecting the kind of the sensory impact of other people's kind of communication in spaces can have a massive impact, and kind of misophonia, kind of sensitivity to sound is a real thing, right? So allowing someone to use noise cancelling headphones, going to work in spaces kind of undisturbed, if that's a problem, then for someone, then kind of respecting that that's a real thing. If they're not able to concentrate on the work on the screen, then clearly something's amiss. You need a different tool.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, for giving so much. And we are out of time. We have to, we just wrap it up in a few minutes, but I feel like everyone is sending so much love, hearts, and just incredible words towards you. I think it's so good to hear the real examples and the real stories and how it works. So it's incredibly practical and helpful. So I really, really appreciate all the work that you do. Also creating the awareness in the broader community. I feel like everything that I've been hearing, like every session that we have with you at Design Leaders Program, I can see people just leaving that completely transformed and kind of rethinking so many things that I know that the work that you do literally transforms lives. So really, really appreciate. We have one last question that we ask all the guests that come on our podcast. So we'd love to ask you that one as well, which is, if you could change one thing in the world, what would it be?
I think that for people to, at least at some point, have a conversation with someone else that makes them feel as though they're not alone.
Hearts are flying your way from everyone, because this is such a beautiful, beautiful answer. And definitely, I think we are not alone, and I think we should talk to each other more. And I think so many things could be resolved if we just talk to each other a bit more and share and talk and understand and listen. Thank you so much, Emma, for this conversation, for the work that you do, for being honest, for being you. And thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully you found that useful. If you found any insight personally useful to you, please share them with a wider audience. I feel like we need to bring more insights and attention to this topic. So don't be shy. Go on LinkedIn, share anything that you found useful, helpful, so more people can know that neurodiversity, being neurodivergent, is a great thing, and we should all celebrate it, and we should all find tools that will help us be better, be more, be ourselves, and collaborate as a creative community. So thanks everyone for joining, and until next time.
Thank you.
Bye.